and it's an opening plenary session. I would like to welcome on behalf of ERF all participants in this 28th annual conference being held under the theme of revisiting macroeconomic management in times of crisis and beyond. The conference deliberations will no doubt bring out highly beneficial thoughts and policy recommendations that address the questions raised under the conference theme. I should like to add that ERF's annual conferences, in fact, the first being held back in 1993, reflect a long ERF tradition of distinguished performance attributable to the unwavering commitment of its constituency, the board, the ERF fellows, the policy networks, the donors, and of course, the dedicated management and staff of ERF. Challenges over the years at the global and regional levels notwithstanding, ERF throughout remained steady on course and stood tall with outstanding achievements. The ERF community, ever growing, can take full pride in that. Before I give the floor to our four distinguished speakers, allow me to ask our distinguished Managing Director, Brahim Barawi, to give a few words, opening remarks. Brahim, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chairman Samir. Would like also to welcome our keynote speaker and the lead commentators and all participants attending this opening plenary of the 28th annual conference of the Economic Research Forum. The theme of this conference is revisiting macroeconomic management in times of crisis and beyond. This theme was determined in a participatory approach around the 27th annual conference last year in a context of a discussion on the future direction of the ERF research with our research fellows who constitute the General Assembly of the research network. And the exceeding majority of the participants from our General Assembly chose the macroeconomic theme, realizing that actually now in the wake of COVID-19 and beyond, and the shocks that impacted the global and regional economies, and now more recently, the war on Ukraine, they are bound actually to have serious implications for several years to come on the thinking and practice of macroeconomic policy. So no doubt the plenaries and panels of this conference should help in promoting a better understanding of the issues that will be addressed in the context of this conference. This conference will address the new emerging macroeconomic and finance agenda, both in terms of issues and research and policy implications, the future of development strategy, social protection agenda, and crisis and innovation in terms of challenges of macroeconomic policy and growth in the wake of COVID-19 and beyond. This annual conference has become a truly flagship event for the economic profession in the Middle East region. Indeed, by far, according to many observers, it is the most important gathering of research economists and policymakers in the MENA region. In this particular conference, there will be 6 plenaries, including a plenary on policy session, and there will be 5 panels for launching new reports reflecting the mushrooming partnership of the ERF network with several international and regional institutions, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, the FAMIS Mediterranean Partnership, and the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. All of these partners have actually presented and will be presenting reports using the forum of the ERF annual conference. There will also be a team parallel session, which this modality, research modality, has been the bread and butter actually of the ERF research, because it is about capacity building and about competitive research for providing opportunities for researchers, especially young researchers, to present proposals and to get funded for research in a competitive and open process. The building on our strong competitive advantage in 2021, the ERF network has been able to turn last year for a robust and new partnership across and beyond the region. The details of these partnerships, mushrooming partnerships, are provided in details in the annual report, which I strongly encourage you to actually take a glance at it if you are unable, of course, due to time constraint, to go through it in more details. It gives you a whole holistic idea about the various activities successfully executed by the ERF in the year past. The joint concern over development issues, joint commitment towards making a difference, joint collaboration among like-minded institutions creates an extraordinary powerful foundation and increases the likelihood of effectiveness of the network. Our thanks are extended to our esteemed partners, the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development, the World Bank, the International Development Research Center, IDRC, and the Ford Foundation, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, the International Labour Organization, the UN Women, ISA Institute of Labour Economics, and the French Development Agency for their continued support, in addition to various other partners and donors that you have been collaborating with. A clear vision and long-standing support are instrumental to success. A special word of gratitude is extended to the ERF Board of Trustees, who kindly served over the last 5 years, 2017 to the end of last year, 2021. The guidance commitment to ERF as a leading network in the region and wisdom in navigating hardship is noteworthy. I would like to acknowledge the ERF affiliates, advisory committee, management team, and staff for their commitment and determination to consistently deliver to the highest standard. In 2022 and beyond, ERF stands ready to help identify areas where its network can contribute to sustainable development. ERF stands ready to address emerging challenges and opportunities. ERF stands ready to deploy multi-stakeholder dialogue platforms to help shape future options. ERF would continue to build its transformative capacity to connect ideas and people, create partnership, contribute to knowledge and policy debate towards a better future. I thank you.
Now to our distinguished keynote speaker, Carmen Reinhardt, who is Senior Vice President and World Bank Group Chief Economist, who will give a PowerPoint presentation on macroeconomic management in times of crisis. Carmen, may I suggest 20 minutes if that's possible? But let me add one more thing. I wanted to prepare something to say about Carmen, to introduce her, but then I thought one sentence would do. She's one of the world's top economic scholars today, and I think that should do it, Carmen. So if possible, 20 minutes would be okay.
Thank you, Samir. Very good.
You're muted, Carmen.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes,
Yes,
we
yes,
do.
we do, we do.
Okay, very good. There we are.
Perfect.
Very good. So, well, thank you for having me, and you know, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. What I would like to do is, you know, divide the talk into two parts. The first part is really setting the stage of the exceptional circumstances that we're living through. In particular, talk about the balance between inflation and recovery at the moment. Then I will talk about the risks of tighter and more volatile global financial conditions. This, you know, the Fed tightening has been long in the making, but there's also issues with China retrenching from lending, and importantly, of course, the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war. And my focus on the policy side, I will touch certainly on debt management and an exchange rate policy, but it's going to tilt towards policy for the central bank policy. So without further ado, let me start on the first part on just setting the stage. I think this is material that we all know. So, you know, we've all lived through this. What this chart shows is that if you go back to 1900, the COVID shock, 2020, at the height of the COVID shock, it was the single year with the largest share of countries globally that had simultaneous contractions in per capita GDP. In other words, it is the largest in terms of most inclusive global recession that we have seen at least since the 1900s. Bigger than World War I, bigger than World War II, and bigger than the Great Depression in terms of the number of countries affected. However, while the shock hit everyone, the recovery process has been very different, and it's been a very uneven recovery. And we basically did, you know, I've done two exercises just to illustrate what that recovery, indeed, I make the point that don't confuse recovery with rebound. My husband, Vincent Reinhardt, and I wrote a piece on that some time ago, relating to as economies were starting to come back after the COVID collapse in 2020. And, you know, there was much discussion of a recovery. I said, wait, you know, what is rebound and what is recovery? So let me define recovery. Recovery means that the level of per capita GDP is at least as high as it ever was before. In other words, you are at or have surpassed the prior peak. That hasn't been the case for the majority of countries, and this is what this table shows. And the distribution between advanced and emerging middle income and emerging low income and developing low income is a very stark divergence. If you look at the share of advanced economies in which 2021 per capita incomes were higher than 2019, that share is about 41%. If you look at the share of middle income, where 2021 per capita GDP was higher, or at least the same or higher as 2019, that share is about 28%, and for the low income is 23%. However, that's not what I want to focus your attention. I want to focus your attention on the fact that many, many emerging markets and developing countries were struggling even before COVID, that per capita incomes had started to slide down even before the COVID shock. And that's the bottom panel of the table, which looks at per capita income in 2021, not just relative to pre-COVID 2019, but relative to whatever the prior peak year was, which for many countries came earlier, 2015, 2016, and in some cases even earlier. And there, the difference between advanced economies and low-income countries in particular is really striking. Only 11.5% of low-income countries today, well, not today, but the latest data through 2021, are at per capita incomes, or at peak per capita incomes. So bottom line, most economies have seen rebounds, but have not really recovered, not recovered fully. Then we have the added problem that after the dislocations of COVID and being in a situation where the recovery has yet to fully materialize, we have higher inflation. What this chart shows here is for advanced economies, the red line, and for emerging markets and developing countries, the blue line, the share of countries that have inflation rates above 5%. And the point to be taken away is that the inflation phenomenon that we've been going through in the very recent period is indeed a global one. Asia as a whole is doing better in the inflation front, but that the rebound in inflation is indeed global. In the United States, we have heard time and time again the discourse that the reason inflation has made such a swift comeback is overheating. I would argue that for most emerging markets and developing countries, overheating is not the main driver. It has to do with commodity prices, the inflation comeback. It has to do with a breakdown of global chains, the important increase in energy prices, now with the war adding to what was already a very sharp comeback in commodities. Oil prices are up around 138% between December 2020 and March of this year. Currency depreciation. Countries hit by these shocks have seen capital inflows retrench. Sovereign credit ratings have been downgraded. And with inflation expectations less anchored than in advanced economies, currency depreciation has also been the driver, rather than overheating, of the rebound in inflation. Food prices. This is a very big concern at the bank, very big concern, because as we all know, food prices is a very special type of inflation, one that has even more regressive consequences. That inflation is a tax, and it is a very regressive tax. Food prices are particularly regressive in that context, since countries, high-income countries, share of food in the consumption basket, in the CPI and the consumer price index, is around 15%. For emerging markets and developing countries, it's 40% and higher. And so the hit to household budgets of rising food prices is disproportionately falls in the emerging markets and low-income countries, and within countries, the most vulnerable households. Putting this together, this is my last slide before turning to the policy issues. Policymakers, governments, and central banks are really facing an extremely risky, precarious situation. What this map shows is a simple division. I've divided the world into 4 quadrants. I'll just describe 2 of them, which really encompass, you can read it in the slide, but the story of overheating, that we're getting high inflation because the economy is running hot, because the recovery after COVID has been so strong. As I said, that story resonates with the US, shown here in red, and the places where there's overheating are shown in red. But the most common denominator in this analysis is the quadrant where countries have higher inflation rates than pre-COVID and lower per capita income than prior peaks, and that's the yellow. So this is it used to be known as stagflation, and that is the setting in which policymakers are faced now with a variety of domestic and external shocks. And on the external front, we have no lack of issues. I will speed up here, but we have, the Fed tightening cycle, which globally has also meant that for many countries, they will see their debt servicing costs rise. Risk aversion in capital markets means capital flows are likely to diminish and become more volatile as international interest rates rise. And let me say that the previous time in the United States where inflation reached the levels that we have seen, remember, in the United States, inflation is running close to 8% on a 12-month basis. This is consumer prices. Producer prices are 10% on a 12-month basis. These are 40-year highs. And I would remind everyone that the exit from low and protracted negative real interest rates, which is what policy has delivered since the global financial crisis, very low, very sustained negative real interest rates, has never been easy. And the last time around that the US was battling inflation in the late 1970s, Paul Volcker raised interest rates by almost 600 basis points in a 6-month period. I'm not suggesting that's what's going to happen here, but that was a draconian policy move. And of course, one wonders what this exit will look like. On the domestic front, things, because of the lack of recovery, because of rising debt levels, public and private, and the general deterioration in the fiscal space, credit rating agencies have been much more active marking down sovereigns in the last 2 years or so. well, really, the last 3 years or so, it has been more pronounced. This is what this chart shows. This is the average numeric score for all the rated sovereigns. And so the combination of weaker pull factors, domestic factors, and more complicated push factors is one that is particularly complicated for policymakers. So I've laid 3 challenges: higher inflation, lack of full recovery, and more volatile and tighter global financial markets. What does this mean? It means we have to pay a great deal of attention to debt management. Debt servicing costs had been rising since around 2010. Debt servicing costs on external debt has about doubled. And this is in the era of low interest rates. This is even before Fed tightening, because this data, which is from the international debt statistics, only goes through 2020. In 2021, the share, the debt servicing share, this is debt servicing relative to export, has continued to increase. So rising rates already are coming on much bigger debt servicing burdens. So this is what brings us to debt management. I think this is an extreme time for very prudential debt management, meaning that the aim of minimizing rollover risk is critical. It is times like this, during turning points, where rollover risk increases, and what often starts as a liquidity crisis can evolve into a solvency crisis. Now, on the debt management front, there are good news and bad news. The good news is that short-term debt, very prone to rollover risk, that share is slightly below the historic average for EMDEs. However, the bad news is that variable rate debt is near an all-time peak, which means that the transmission of higher interest rates, as international interest rates rise, it is likely to transmit quickly to debt servicing costs, hence my emphasis on debt management. Reminding everyone that while emerging markets as a group have much lower debt levels than the advanced economies, much lower. Emerging markets, as Ken Rogoff, Miguel Sebastano, and I have called, are debt intolerant. In other words, very prone to having debt problems and falling into debt distress, even at very low levels of debt. I'm going to go quickly here because I want to turn to monetary policy. So I've talked about the importance of turning very strong attention to prudent debt management, and the aim being limiting rollover risk. On the central bank side, the exit from very negative interest rates in Egypt, less negative than in many other places, but emerging markets as a whole, and advanced economies as a whole, are still in deep negative real interest rate territory, which means that normalization is part of the solution to the spike in inflation. It is difficult to envision continued monetary accommodation as it has been during the past 2 years to fight the COVID effects, in being able to deal with inflation. There has been, during the last 2 years, a great tendency to finance the larger deficits associated with the collapsing revenues, associated with the declines in economic activities, to finance those deficits by borrowing from the central bank. What this chart shows here is that countries that have routinely relied on financing from the central bank have ended up with higher, indeed double-digit inflation rates. So I think the temptation to finance domestic debt through central bank purchases is one that carries a great many risks. And one of those risks is currency crashes, seeing more instability in the currency. Now, Guillermo Calvo and I wrote a long time ago a paper called Fear of Floating. I think one of the things I do want to highlight are that as difficult as this sounds, and I will elaborate further, this is not the time for fear floating. Betting against the market has usually ended badly for central banks. Quick loss of reserves can, at a time in which foreign exchange should have better uses than to accommodate capital flight, reserves can be quickly, central bank reserves can be quickly lost. Central banks also can try to defend via interest rate increases, which, as I said, are needed anyway to deal with the higher inflation. But you know, interest rate hikes also has its limitations and its costs. But the bottom line is trying to peg or semi-peg the exchange rate in an environment like this one is a losing proposition, and will lead to, given this depends enormously on the country characteristics and so on, but it will lead to more vibrant parallel market exchange rates, parallel markets. So let me move on because I know I'm out of time. I want to recap that to state that this is a challenging time for governments and central bank is really an understatement. I think for central banks that are fresh still in the inflation targeting framework, credibility takes time to build, but can be quickly lost. So I think that we cannot lose sight that the mandate of a central bank is to maintain price stability. And I would add that even though, you know, tighter monetary policy sounds counterintuitive in an environment in which the economy has yet to fully recover for many countries. Let me reiterate, inflation is a very regressive tax. Inflation that comes together with food price inflation is extremely regressive tax. So from the social standpoint, there are no silver bullets, but it's important to recognize that inflation targeting is also dealing with the very adverse redistributional effects in terms of inequality that rising inflation challenges poses. I know Egypt, for instance, introduced price controls on bread recently. I would suggest countries rely more on transfers and safety nets that rather than price controls Price controls in the past have not worked out too well and also give rise to black markets. And I will stop by saying that the impetus for tightening policy do not wait for the Fed. The Fed has had a history, especially in the 70s, of delaying, and in effect, delays in stabilizing inflation in the US ended up being very costly, not just for the US in terms of a deep recession, but it led to a spike in interest rates that ended up being the crisis of the 1980s. These are very difficult times to navigate, and I think being risk averse on both the fiscal and not forgetting the mandate of the central bank on inflation, and that targeting nominal exchange rates hasn't worked too well in the past, especially in times of great risk and uncertainty. Those are some of the messages I have, and I'll stop here.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Reinhardt. Dr. Samir, would you like to unmute and take on? You're on mute, Dr. Samir.
Okay, now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I want to thank Carmen very, very much for this fantastic presentation. And I wanted also to add, I wish you'd come to Lebanon and teach our governor, central bank, how to behave where we have now 1,000% rate of inflation and the depreciation of the pound from what used to be 1,000 to 30,000 per US dollar. So we are living exactly the bad consequences of which Carmen has been warning about. Anyhow, well, perhaps she will visit Lebanon at some point. Thank you so much, Carmen. Now I will call upon our distinguished commentators, and I begin with Rania Mashat, who is the Minister of International Cooperation and a very distinguished economist on her own. Rania, would 10 minutes do, please?
Thank you so much, Dr. Samir, and it's a pleasure being back at ERF. I started the first summer intern in 1994, and it's also a very special session because Professor Carmen is one of my PhD advisors. So a lot of the papers that she was discussing is what she taught us in grad school. And I want to take from what she said, because the world has become more complicated than where we were several years ago. And, you know, in the past, when the Fed used to move, all central banks around would follow suit. Today, we have a complication of deciphering what is affecting inflation. You have a compounded impact compared to where we were after COVID. We have the recovery versus the rebound. We have the food prices, which are fundamental in CPI baskets in emerging markets. We also have oil prices, which are also compounding the supply shocks affecting emerging markets. And then we are facing all of this at a time when, after 2 years of COVID, the fiscal space has become so tight. So if we take the 2020 and 2021, we always used to use the word, there's a silver lining. There's a silver lining in pushing reforms that would allow social safety nets. There's a silver lining in trying to create more cooperation on a multilateral platform to overcome COVID. Today, as Dr. Carmen mentioned, there's no silver bullet. And I really don't see a silver lining in this compounded crisis that we are living in. The other very important lesson, and this is very evident in the presentation by Professor Carmen, is coupling. In the past, we used to have these discussions: is the world coupled or decoupled? Today, and after COVID, everybody is connected, and the transmission that is taking place is quite hefty. The other looking at the pull versus push factors. And it always used to be the case that when governments are reforming and doing well, that's a pull for capital inflows, be it the short-term nature or the ones that are more long-term for investments. What we are seeing today with the war is an uncertainty around what is happening globally. And therefore, the reform agenda that would be country-specific, we have to ask ourselves, would it be enough and compelling enough for this capital, which is being faced with enormous uncertainties, to actually come in? And then the push factors, as I mentioned, a mounting number of supply shocks which are hitting economies. And then, where does this leave us? I think that, and let me just mention before where it leaves us, I just add here financing for climate, which was supposed to be, we're getting out of COVID, and there was this very big theme around financing climate, the climate agenda. We finished Glasgow, we are entering 2022, gearing up for COP, thinking how we can do private-public partnerships or leverage concessional financing to actually push the climate agenda. And then we're faced by this crisis. So there's a climate element which is also quite significant. And I would love that Carmen adds in her presentation maybe a slide or two on that, because it's also one of the expectations from emerging markets, given that when we talk about the recovery has to be green, and the ability to access markets today is also a function of how well a country is able to design its climate strategies, and how able it is and convincing it is to the international community with respect to its NDCs and with respect to its green transition. So that is an additional item that was on the agenda at the beginning of 2022, and now we're faced with all of this. And I believe that to move forward, and as was very clearly laid out, we have fiscal policy, we have monetary policy. The credibility that was built over years in emerging markets is now a little bit shaky given everything that is happening. So what about some of the innovative financing tools that were discussed before 2022? Is the international community able to come in and try and help with thinking about how to do blended? How can we bring in some of this? Because that is a very big part of the discussion, and rightly so, even though the debt in emerging markets is low, but this concept of debt intolerability and debt stress is very evident, and rating agencies have no mercy, correct? So they, regardless of the reasons behind the crises, and particularly now that it's not really country specific, this is a global crisis. And Carmen, your next book is being structured now because in each and every 10 years you have been able to analyze the debt situation in emerging markets and give us a prescription. This time it's coming out of COVID with already a very big debt burden, and countries' domestic policy shouldered a lot of what had to happen to create the rebound or create the recovery. And I appreciate very much this distinction, because we were just about to move out of the complication of COVID, and then this happens. So I think that when we're talking about debt going forward, there has to be a revisit of what types of instruments are going to be available. We have to start thinking about debt swaps. We have to be thinking about what would the multilateral development banks do to help emerging markets at this particular juncture. This is not a very easy juncture. It's a very complicated one. And emerging markets are going to be paying the brunt of it. And here, when I say emerging markets, it's the people, correct? So it's not just the policy, it's really the implications on, and you're absolutely correct. There's the World Bank just came out with the report where they're saying these compounded shocks are going to affect inequalities within countries and across countries. And that is again, a retrenchment from the 2030 SDG agenda, where everybody was, racing forward to try and achieve the SDGs, which includes equality, includes a cleaner environment, includes more equality for women and so forth. So all of these agendas are becoming, I would say, hijacked, if you will, or detrimentally affected by this compounded elements of shock. And by the way, the verdict is still out. So, we're trying to use the macroeconomics and the fiscal and monetary policies that we've learned over the years to make sense of this and make our policies meaningful. But at the same time, and I think one of the questions that was posed to the panel participants was, is inflation targeting and its framework still a credible way forward? And what should governments and central banks do in terms of their coordination and so forth when you have a shock of this magnitude? So just to conclude, I feel that the exit from all of this requires a coordinated effort. If we, as an international community, coordinated during COVID to find COVAX, to create COVAX for vaccinations, this is another shock which requires collective effort. And we have to realize that emerging markets are coming out of a situation where they were still, starting to, just to give an example, the tourism globally was starting to come back. Today, the disposable income for everybody globally is coming down. So are we going to expect the same type of and tourism globally accounts for 10% of global GDP, for instance. So where are we in all of this? So I think that my call would be to try and think about a coordinated or more cooperation when it comes to trying to find exits. Innovative tools for financing are extremely important. Today, I'm talking to you from Dubai during the Climate Week, and we have ASQA showed a report where they're talking about debt swaps for climate change and green. So we have to really think about how we can activate and expedite these new tools, because there are going to be enormous financing needs for all countries globally. And it is the supply chains that have been cut and the cost of transportation of food is one that raising interest rates will not do it. So we need to think a little bit with unconventional global tools, and we need to think about this fast. So I look forward to engaging with Carmen during the spring meetings in Washington, D.C. coming up in April. But definitely your presentation and all the themes that were in it are going to be the center of the discussion that takes place next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rania. Dr. Samir, we're now ready to move further.
Yes, I would like to invite Majid Al-Munif, Chairman of the International Advisory Committee of King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. Majid, the floor is yours also for 10 minutes, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for, I'd like to thank ERF for inviting me to this session, and thanks to Professor Reinhardt for this great and enlightening presentation. My comments will focus mainly on the impact of COVID and the turmoil in energy markets on the economies of the Gulf Cooperation Council, being a major part of the hydrocarbon producing, MENA producing countries. I've got a few slides to show. I'll talk about the twin shocks of the pandemic and oil price collapse, and the recovery, and also to the impact of the Russia-Ukraine crisis on the policy choices of the hydrocarbon producers of the Gulf. First, on the impact of the COVID and the oil price collapse, the pandemic and its impact on the global economy and mobility caused something like 9% year-on-year decline in oil demand, which impacted production, exports, prices, which declined over the year by something like 35%, but it declined a lot more than that in the first quarter of 2020. The GCC fiscal and external deficits widened, and the oil, non-oil, and overall GDP contracted by something like 6 to 7% for the oil sector and 4% for the non-oil sector. The policies that were taken during the pandemic had to balance the fiscal expansion and the declining oil revenues and the increasing public debt with the an ongoing then after the price collapse of 2015, the fiscal, economic, and financial and the labor market reforms that were underway. The early lockdowns and the widespread access of vaccine improved the quality of the health services, and the digital transformation and relatively low share of public debt to GDP helped in the recovery. Generally, the GCC had the highest percentage of vaccinated population in the region, something like in the 80% compared to some 43 or 40% in MENA. The fiscal measures taken by increasing health spending, social transfers, the extension and increasing subsidies, unemployment benefits and support, and the concessionary loans, all those fiscal measures were something like 2.3% of GDP. They're relatively low. They reflect the large size of the government spending in GDP and the fact that the majority of the working national population were in the public sector already, and the departure of large number of expatriates during the pandemic, which eased the burden on the labor market and unemployment. The measures provided relief to hard-hit sectors, businesses, and financial systems, eased the burden on households and firms. Some support measures, such as funds and job retention schemes, increased the sensitivity of public finances to future corporate and financial sector developments. Besides, the corporates and households have become more dependent on government and bank support, especially with the extension of some measures such as loan deferrals and guarantees and guaranteed credit facilities. Range of macro financial support measures by the central bank eased the financial conditions through low rates and liquidity injections, low loan repayment deferrals, and relaxed prudential requirements on bank buffers and liquidity ratios. All in all, non-oil primary balance is as percent of non-oil GDP deteriorated, reaching something like 30 to almost 40% of non-oil GDP, reflecting the fiscal support measures and the contraction of non-oil GDP. The recovery of in 2021 was or benefited from the oil market rally during 2020. Crude oil prices over the year increased by something like 70% over the 2020. So did oil production, revenues, and GDP, which increased by, remarkably. but the recovery was not uniform depending on the shares of the contact-intensive sectors share in non-oil GDP. They range between like 34 to 35% in countries like UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, and down from 25 to 26% in Saudi Arabia and Oman. So the recovery was a little bit faster in these two countries. The banking system entered the COVID-19 with ample capital liquidity, and banks deposit to assets reached 180% of GDP compared to something like 100% just 5 years ago. The inflation was relatively mild during and after the pandemic. It is due to the currency peg, or most of the currencies pegged to the dollars, and the insulation of domestic energy market from the global ones, which contributed to the quick recovery. Equity prices recovered, but generally, most of the policies have to balance the gradual phasing out of pandemic-related support measures and enhancing non-oil revenues and rationalizing the capital spending and ensuring efficiency of capital. Just as oil demand was recovering at the end of 2021 and early 2022, the Russia-Ukraine crisis caused further escalation in oil prices by year-to-date average by something like 42%. This is atop the 70% increase in 2021. This supply-induced crisis will have 4 transmission channels into the GCC economies. In the real oil market channel, fiscal, financial, and monetary. It will pose few policy dilemmas. First, the oil market trade-offs. It's between the responses to supply shortages by increasing investments in the upstream, midstream, and downstream oil and gas to meet short and medium-term global demand on the one hand, and the responses to the long-run global energy transition away from fossil fuels on the other. So this is a dilemma between the short and medium-term responses to the oil markets. The other dilemma that they will be facing is how to use the increase in oil revenues to support public finances, reduce public debt, improve macroeconomic outlook on the one hand, while avoiding customary pro-cyclical fiscal policies on the other. This has been a major concern of all of the countries, all oil exporting countries throughout the years. We also have the economic policies trade-offs through strengthening fiscal, monetary, and macroprudential frameworks induced by oil price swings and the rising global inflation on the one hand, and reducing reliance on oil through economic and export diversification, spending in human capital, promoting competition, improving governance, and reducing distorting subsidies. In general, the main policy conclusions from the pandemic and the recovery and the current crisis on the policy, fiscal policy, it is how to aim, that should aim to ensure long-term fiscal and external sustainability, and strengthening fiscal framework, mobilizing non-oil revenues, increasing spending efficiency, reducing budgetary items, avoid past patterns of pro-cyclical policies, and use extra revenues to rebuild policy space and enact credible medium-term fiscal framework and public outreach. On this particular one, related to this, it is the alignment of the sovereign wealth funds to the fiscal frame, to this fiscal framework through inflow and outflow rules that would ensure consistent fiscal anchors. On the financial stability and a dynamic financial sector, strengthening the insolvency and resolution frameworks, and stepping up the supervisory issues. Since generally the bank, there's a concentration of bank ownership in the region, something like 65 to 95% of the banking is owned by 4 or 5 banks in each of those countries. So there will be an issue of the concentration of ownership of the banking sector that they might have grappled with. Promote sustainable economic growth to create jobs, enhance competitiveness and diversification, especially in the context of a decarbonized world, by incorporating the different scenarios, emission scenarios and oil price path into the macroeconomic and investment strategies, and being part of the global framework to address climate change. This could be through the diversifying into hydrocarbons to enhance their competitive advantage, promote circular carbon economy, carbon capture utilization, direct air capture, leveraging non-combustible uses of oil, and integrating the energy sector into the overall economy. Addressing labor market distortions. This has been a major issue for the GCC. The labor market is differentiated between expatriates, national, public, private sector, men, women, and so on. This involves raising female labor participation rates, which are in the GCC in general, the lowest in the region and the lowest worldwide. Increase flexibility for expatriates and narrowing the expatriate nationals wage gap. This is a major issue in the labor market, and improving education equality. That's what I have. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Samir, you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you.
Dr. Majid.
Thank you very much, Majid. Raimundo Soto is the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. He is with the Institute of Economics, and he's a friend and a colleague. Raimundo, 10 minutes, because Shireen, can we go beyond 4:30?
Certainly, not a
because
problem.
we started a bit late, and
that's not a problem.
Okay,
That's
Raimundo, 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks also to ERF for the invitation of being here. And of course, thanks to Carmen Reinhardt for a very nice presentation, and a little frightening presentation also, because the situation is, as she said, quite tenuous. We have tightening financial conditions, very tight actually, higher and rising private and public debt, rising inflation, uneven recovery. And well, being the last discussant of the presentation, I thought that my colleagues would have said almost everything about the presentation, and indeed they did. The two other discussants did an excellent job. So I will move from the very short term into a longer run and challenge the viewpoint implicit, I think it is, that the crisis is sort of a transitory phenomenon, perhaps with long-lasting strands, but basically a transitory phenomenon that standard policies, macro policies can deal with. I think Her Excellency Rania Al-Mashad mentioned that some of these phenomena may not be very transitory, and Mr. Al-Monif also linked his comments to the fact that there are long-standing issues in the GCC countries, but I guess in the region, regarding labor markets, diversification of exports, dependency on oil and oil proceeds in the fiscal area and the like. So I will move into the longer run and basically ask myself, what if some of the effects of COVID are permanent? And a second question, what if the political situation that we're looking at deteriorates even further or more dramatically? Okay. What are the long-lasting or permanent? We don't know until they prove permanent or long-lasting. What are these effects of COVID that we should take into account? One is that the shock was had a very asymmetric immediate impact on different population groups. On one hand, you have widening geographic and spatial inequality in terms of health and welfare, in terms of the local economic risks that different groups in the population within countries and among countries have been facing. Some segments of the economy have been very resilient, while others have been very weak. Poverty has been spread unevenly, and opportunities are now on a far more uneven situation than before. Health outcomes have worsened, and inequalities in health access and also financing have increased. We have also this new issue coming up of mental health impacts, in part because the support has been disrupted, but also because the COVID has generated new mental health issues with foreseeable negative long-term impact. In addition to the immediate asymmetric shock, structural inequalities have been exacerbated. Long-term incomes have been declining, as mentioned by Professor Reinhardt at the beginning. Poverty has been rising. Education and intergenerational issues have become prominent with the COVID in terms of how unequal distribution of the benefits are. Children have been largely affected, and there are also some dimensions of gender inequality and ethnicity in terms of the response of governments to COVID. Some have been arguing that the lost education will never recover. These 2 years or even more than 2 years of lost education for primary, secondary, and even tertiary education will exacerbate inequality in attainment and in adopting digital education, which seems to be a shock that is unveiling now. The COVID has also generated additional pressure on governments, on revenue streams on one hand, and of government spending on the other. I think Professor Reinhardt touched upon these issues on very eloquently. And the increasing levels of debt and debt service in the future and possible falling tax revenues will put a lot more pressure on the governments than we used to have. And falling unemployment and falling household income will lead to increased dependency of these groups and any other groups on social security or transfers from government when social security is just not there. And it will generate increasing demands for support or for redistribution in a context, as Rania Mashad said, of very, very tight fiscal space, very limited fiscal space, and increasingly limited fiscal space. Okay. In general, there's a feeling or an appreciation that the trust in the government and in governance in general has decreased, and that an important part of the responsibilities have been taken by the local communities in areas where the government is unable to perform the duties. Okay. So what and how should we look at policies when the effects of COVID are permanent, not transitory? Rania Mashad talked about the tourism industry. We can think of other industries around that have been affected severely affected by the COVID pandemic. I will focus only on the labor market, but you can extend the analysis to any of these other areas. Consider that the changes are permanent in the labor market. Changing working hours, remote labor is now, or remote work is now generalized. There is a tendency to substitute away from workers and into capital or technology in order to avoid the problems of shutting down or moving production. The digital economy is far more prominent now than before. So the key question would be, which policies would ease the transition to this new normal? In which direction, for example, you should adjust regulation in order to make this transition as smooth and costless as possible, and at the same time provide with the incentives for the different workers on one hand and firms on the other hand to adjust to the new normal. How should we align education and human capital formation with new market requirements? I'm not saying that these are far more important than what the previous discussants and the keynote speaker indicated. It may not invalidate at all standard macro policy prescription of being prudent in the monetary side, being prudent in the debt side and in fiscal affairs, but perhaps these macro policy prescriptions may be insufficient for the kind of shock and the kind of challenge that COVID has placed on us. So one key issue would be, can or should government postpone structural reforms that were being discussed and that are needed to cope with the changing situation, permanent changing situation that we're looking at? And can we think of COVID-19 as a window of opportunity for far-reaching reforms along the lines that the two other discussants have mentioned, that will allow us to seize the opportunity that COVID is presenting us by shaking the way in which we used to do things and what we call business as usual? It might be the case that that window is there, but it's not going to be there forever. So if shocks are permanent, then policies, standard macro policies should be there, but new policies should be added in order to generate a meaningful transition to a new normal. The second area, which I mentioned at the beginning of my two questions, what if the political situation deteriorates a lot? And I don't know much about crisis management, so I look at the literature, and crises are characterized as events that pose a significant challenge to society, that come as a surprise, and that give a short window of opportunity to decision making. And in order to deal with a crisis, you need leadership, and leadership that would allow for building an environment of trust, reforming the society's mindset to the new normal, identify, obviously, vulnerabilities, making wise and rapid decisions, as well as taking courageous action, and learning from crisis, so that is a feedback there from the situation to the leadership, so that the leadership can take and effect change. So when I looked at this literature on crisis management, and I look at the political situation that we have, I get a little nervous because management actually led to a very different kind of response by governments. Suppressing individual liberties has been all over. Protests have been met more with force than reasoning. Crises that usually lead to political change cannot be anticipated if it's going to be pro or against democracy, pro or against freedom, and pro or against inclusion. And judging by the response of the different governments to the Ukraine-Russia crisis, the quality of the policy response is doubtful, is frightening. I don't see the political arena to be in the direction of generating the conditions for peace. In fact, I am in a position of doubt whether trading oil and gas for peace promises is a sound strategy. And I will go into an area which is not my expertise, so I might be saying or making statements that sorry about that. Yeah. Or making statements that go beyond my paycheck. But the current situation in Ukraine, I think, is very, very dangerous. Mr. Putin and his tacit or explicit allies have annexed the Crimea Peninsula in 2014, which is more or less the size of Belgium and Netherlands together, have invaded Ukraine in 2022, and I cannot stop thinking of who's going to be next. Does history repeat itself? And are we looking at the same conditions, for example, that went there in 1938 when Nazi Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and basically started the conditions for a new massive conflict? So I'm going to stop there. My time is over, and my last comment is very harsh, I know, but I'm scared.
Dr. Samir, you're muted.
Yes, thank you very much, Raimundo. Especially your political questions that someone has to answer at some point. I would like to suggest to give the floor to Carmen to respond, say in about 5 to 6 minutes, Carmen, and then I don't think we have very many questions from the floor, but then I'll open it to those who would like to pose questions from the floor. So Carmen, please go ahead and comment.
So I really want to thank all three of you for excellent and insightful comments. And I think a common strand in the three sets of comment are very important. In terms of, and the one thing I disagree with Raimundo is calling it permanent. Few things in life are permanent, but many are quite persistent. And I am in full agreement that we're facing very persistent changes. So, but I think all three of you highlighted that these challenges are going to be with us for some time, and that also the cyclical considerations are also on top of a structural agenda. And Rania mentioned the environment, for example. Now, just hear me out. I on two parts of my presentation, I really emphasized that even before COVID, already there was a reversal underway. So COVID actually hit many countries. Raimundo, this isn't the case for Chile, but which has already fully recovered per capita income, but that's not the majority. So many were already starting from, many countries were starting from a weaker position hit by COVID. So hence my endpoint reference as a caution to the 1980s, because the 1980s turned out to be a lost decade for many developing countries, which brings me back to your comments that I agree that the maintaining the pace of structural changes at a time in which a cyclical situation is very complicated it is a real challenge. And my concern, for example, this is a big concern that I express at the bank all the time, is that like the greening, which is so needed, is going to be put in a back burner, because of the shrinking fiscal space, because of the more immediate putting out of fires. And let me say also, and maybe ditto for also the labor market reforms that were alluded to. And one final point, and I'll stop here so we have time for discussion, that Raimundo made. I am also very scared about the social consequences. I've reiterated in my remarks that few things are more regressive than things like food inflation, coupled with an exhaustion in many social programs, coupled with the setbacks that we've seen on health and education. This kind of environment is really toxic for social unrest. And I would note that if you look at the Freedom Index, which I follow closely what Freedom House does, it's already been turning in the other direction. So this is, a time to really, because historically, one thing that tends to happen is that reversals in economic fortunes lead to reversals in policy. And that is something to be, very, very watchful for, especially when we do have policies where we don't like, the climate change policies that we really can't afford to delay even longer. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Let me see whether any of the discussants would like to respond to the comments of Carmen, and then I'll open it to the rest. Any of the discussants would like to add something in light of what Carmen just said? And
if I may, there's Aryan Dahan from IDRC in the chat. He's conveying a message. Greetings from Ottawa. Thank you for an excellent panel. Would love to hear more about, if I understood correctly, Professor Reinhardt's proposal for tightened monetary policy with compensatory transfers, how to avoid the structural adjustment experience of lost development decade.
So, Rania, something else that you'd care to add? And then I'll ask Majid and then Raimundo.
No, I mean, I think in order to try and avoid a lost decade is to expedite how we will be able to restructure debt. I mean, it's a situation now that, and in Carmen's presentation, there's a chart that quantifies where we were and where we are, and if we even have projections going forward, it's even more. And there have been so many discussions lately on this, and different. The UN has been talking about it in the context of COVID, and absolutely correct, as Professor Reinhardt mentioned. It comes, because there were issues related to that even before COVID. So I think that has to be taken very, very seriously and very, very fast.
Majid?
Thank you. I hear of a lost decade, but here in the region, since we are an ERF, we've been having lost decades, not a lost decade. Even when during periods of oil price increases in the beginning of the century and so on. Now the 90s was a lost decade, so was the 80s and so on. So I hope that the ERF would look into that and when it comes to a lost decade, which was the most, but I like that idea of a lost decade, and viewing it from the outside, I see the region, the Middle East region, has had lost decades.
Yes, right. Decades, not one decade. Decades. You're right.
Decades.
Raimundo?
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah,
Mr.
yes.
Chairman, Dr. Rania Al-Mashat needs to leave.
Oh, okay.
So
Well,
we want to thank her.
great. Indeed. Thank you very much, Sharon. That was a great comment on your part, and hope we'll see you very, very soon.
Thank you. I just want to thank the ERF for choosing this topic at this very important juncture. And there's no one better to talk about it than the authority on exchange rates and debt and monetary policy, except Professor Carmen Reinhardt. So we're all very lucky that she was with us. And I think the presentation is going to be a very important reference for academicians, policymakers, and everyone who's interested in the topic. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you. Raimundo?
Yeah, I would like to follow up on a comment that Rania Mashat just mentioned. In a paper that was presented yesterday at the conference, there is an interesting exercise of looking at debt restructuring before the default and after a default. And of course, before the default, the debt restructuring has a less of a damaging impact on the economy. Growth recovers faster, inflation is controlled easier, and therefore we should start thinking about if debt restructuring is going to be a big issue, to do it in advance of the crisis and not after the crisis. The last decade in Latin America was mainly due to the fact that of our indebtedness and like, but also that we postponed the adjustment and the restructuring of the debt way too long. If it would have been done earlier, perhaps the effects would have been less damaging. So if that is a way to go, then let's move forward into identifying what is needed to be done before the crisis has already hit us.
Thank you, Raimundo. Shireen, do we have any speakers from outside, from our audience?
Yes, there are a couple of questions, and Dr. Ibrahim's got his hand raised. So I think in the interest of time, I would just read out the two comments and to give a chance for the panelists to respond to briefly after Dr. Ibrahim makes his comments across. Dr. Ibrahim?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Carmen, for a very insightful presentation and the comments from the lead commentators. Tomorrow we'll be listening to Danny Roderick about the future of development strategy or development strategy in the future. And I think one of the very interesting points that he made and seems to overlap with your recommendation about the need for social programs rather than subsidies. He suggested that actually in view of the changing technology, underlying technology, high productivity is no longer automatically associated with job creation. And we'll be faced with a situation where we will have some firms and some economic activities that are highly productive, but not very labor absorbing as used to be. And therefore, growth strategies has to be intertwined with social agenda, especially social protection and full employment or almost full employment macroeconomic policy. How do you see this impacting the design of macroeconomic policy going forward?
Are you posing a question, Ibrahim? Yeah,
this is a question to Carmen and the panelists.
Comment,
Mainly to Carmen, really, because
comment, please.
So very briefly, I mentioned that things like price controls, parallel market exchange rates have a really dismal history. If you look, I mean, there's two-way causality issues at these things. You introduce controls and you segment parallel, and you introduce parallel exchange rate markets in bad time, but it makes things worse. So, but if you look at their track record in both in terms of growth and inflation, it's really abysmal track record. But at the same time, you're hit with a shock, on top of COVID, we now have the Russia-Ukraine war, which has really, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, many countries in Europe, big importers of grain from Russia and Ukraine. These are major, as I keep hammering away, regressive shocks. How do you compensate? How do you because this is really big time erosion to already frail household incomes. And so I think digitization has helped make transfers. That's one of the few encouraging things that has come out of COVID. It is made, more viable delivery systems for transfers. And I think the aim is to, notwithstanding recognizing that budgets are strained, these are really major shocks. It's strengthening the social safety nets, including getting support from the likes of the World Bank, the MDBs, for strengthening those social safety nets, rather than go the route of, more controls, more distortionary policies that are introduced as temporary, but once introduced as temporary, can be very difficult to withdraw. And in effect, I'll conclude by saying the rating agency Fitch, maybe 2-3 weeks ago, had a piece saying as countries are confronted with these shocks, they're introducing more subsidies also for energy, we are watching that, because also that has had adverse impacts and on budgets, on economic performance, and we're watching that. So the rating agencies are also there on the sidelines, waiting to see how countries, what kinds of policies are used to deal with the shocks.
Thank you, Carmen. Are there any other comments to be made, Shireen?
Very telegraphically, because I'm conscious that we have to sign off in 5 minutes, and we've been, Dr. Reinhardt has been very generous with her time with us. We're very grateful. There's a quick comment from Dr. Mahmoud Sami Nabi. I think that there is urgency to extend the debt service suspension initiative to the middle income countries with minimum conditionalities during the current time. What do you think? And there's also another one from Professor Mahmoud Haddad. When do you think real interest rate will become positive? Negative interest rate is double taxation, inflation plus below zero, a return on financial portfolios.
Okay. If no more comments with that, I would like to express our great appreciation for the 10 minutes.
I think that Carmen was just about.
Oh, Carmen, sorry. Carmen,
Carmen,
go ahead.
Very quickly. How quickly are we going to get out of real rates? I think a cue is going to be taken from the Federal Reserve. Do not expect, we're moving in that direction, but do not expect overwhelmingly rapid results, because I think there's also fear of the exit itself and what it does to financial fragility, what it does to equity market prices, what it does. So there's fear of too swift the rate hike, but I think we're moving in that direction. And finally, on the issue of extension to middle income countries, look, from what I've seen, there is a great deal of inertia right now among the official, let alone the private sector, on getting debt relief to countries, even low-income countries, let alone EMs, middle-income EMs. There's very little appetite. Remember, in the DSSI, we had it for 2 years, and we never even had zero private sector participation. You know, yes, we want that, but getting it done is a major there's a major vacuum in leadership there.
Thank you. I guess we have come to the end of our very, very interesting and beneficial session that we've had now. We've learned a lot, things that I didn't know, and we learned a lot from what you've said. Thank you very much, Carmen. This was great. And I want to thank Raimundo and Majid for the great comments. Hopefully the post-COVID world will be better than the pre-COVID world. And with that, I will again express our great appreciation for all speakers and hope to see you soon again. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You.